10. My Amish mother removed one button from my wedding dress. I learned why that night. The room was warm from the dying wood stove, yet my hands were cold against the wedding dress. Oil lamplight moved softly across the linen, pale and uneven, like breath held too long. I stood still on the pine floor, listening to the slow sewing downstairs, each stitch rising through the boards like a quiet heartbeat. My fingers stopped at the collar. One button was gone. The seam was too smooth, too clean, like it had always been that way. I did not yet know why my mother had changed it. What I am about to tell you, I have never said aloud without feeling that silence again. My name is Mary Amish Home, and this is the channel where I share the memories I never spoke in daylight. If you stay with me, you will understand what silence can carry inside a family. Tell me in the comments if you have ever discovered a hidden kindness from someone you trusted. The dress hung heavy between my hands, not heavy with cloth alone, heavy with something unspoken. Collar pressed softly against my thumb as I traced the empty space where a button should have been. Downstairs, my mother moved slowly near the table, the sound of sewing steady and patient, like she had all the time in the world and I had none left to ask questions. I stood in that stillness, feeling my breath tighten, as if the room itself had leaned closer to listen. I did not remember this change being made. Linen smelled faintly of lavender soap and iron steam. Oil lamplight flickered across the stitches, making the missing place look deeper than it was. I touched it again, slower this time, as if the fabric might speak back. There was no rough thread, no sign of struggle, only care. Yet care without memory can feel like distance. My chest tightened as I listened for my mother's footsteps. She did not come. Only the wood creaked softly under her weight below. In my home, wedding clothing followed ordnung, quiet order that shaped even small things like thread and fold. A dress was not only cloth, it was a promise of stillness, of humility before God and community. My mother had always been the one to prepare such things. Her hands knew more rules than words ever did. Sometimes changes were made without asking, for modesty, for comfort, for reasons not spoken aloud. I used to believe that silence meant nothing. Now I was beginning to learn it could mean too much. I stepped back from the dress and folded my hands. The room felt wider, yet somehow closer at the same time. My mother's sewing paused for only a moment below, then continued again, steady as before. It made me think of how many things in a home are decided without sound, without discussion, only through action that cannot be undone. If you have ever experienced something like that, I would be grateful if you stayed and listened with me here and shared your thoughts with Mary Amish Home on this channel. That morning had begun in the kitchen, with steam rising from boiled linen. My mother stood near the table, the tin box open beside her, filled with small pearl buttons that caught the light like quiet moons. I remember her fingers pausing longer than I understood at the time. One button rested between her thumb and forefinger, held too carefully to be simple. She did not look at me when she chose it not to be replaced. I thought she was only adjusting fit. I did not yet understand hesitation. The pearl button stayed in her hand longer than needed, not dropped, not sewn, simply held, then placed back into the tin box as if returning something that had already been decided. The sound of it touching metal was small. I remember it clearly. My mother's face was calm, but her eyes were not hurried. There are moments in a home that feel ordinary while carrying something far heavier beneath them. I only realized this later, much later. There was a woman I once knew, Leah, my older cousin, who had her own wedding season years before mine. No one spoke much about the small change made to her dress either. Only that afterward, she did not return to singings the same way. People in my home did not explain such things. They only adjusted and continued forward. I remember thinking she had simply changed. Now I wonder how many changes were never truly hers alone. That night I stood alone in my room. The dress hung near the window, pale in lamplight, moving slightly with the air from the wood stove below. My fingers found the empty button space again, softer now, as if it had warmed with touch. The house was quiet except for my mother's final steps downstairs. Then even those stopped, and in that silence, I felt something I could not yet name settle between us, as if the answer was already there, waiting in the dark without words. The silence from that night did not leave quickly. It stayed in the room like a second layer of cloth I could not remove. Even after the wedding day came and passed, I still felt it when I touched the dress again. The missing button no longer felt like a question. It felt like something already answered without me present. Downstairs, the house was dim, the lamps lowered, the world softened into evening breath, and I finally understood that what I had not been told was still living with us. My mother called me to sit near the table that night. Her hands were folded, still smelling faintly of soap and thread. The kerosene lamp between us made her shadow large on the wall, steady and unmoving. She did not begin with explanation, only with the dress, laid carefully between us like something fragile and already decided. I remember how my throat tightened before she even spoke, because I had learned by then that silence often spoke first in my home. My mother called me to sit near the table that night. Her hands were folded, still smelling faintly of soap and thread. Kerosene lamp between us made her shadow large on the wall, steady and unmoving. She did not begin with explanation, only with the dress, laid carefully between us like something fragile and already decided. I remember how my throat tightened before she even spoke, because I had learned by then that silence often spoke first in my home. There was no shame in her words, no confession, no apology. Only the careful logic of someone who had carried a decision alone. I looked at the pearl button still inside the tin box. It seemed smaller now than I remembered. Not powerful, not symbolic in the way I had imagined. Only a small object chosen for a reason that lived outside my understanding at the time. And I realized I had been waiting for a storm that never came. Both things are true. She changed the dress without telling me. And she did it because she thought it was right for me. In my home, love and control often lived in the same hand. One did not cancel the other, simply stayed together even when it was hard to separate them. I also did not ask, I also did not speak, and that silence belonged to me as much as it did to her. Later I thought again of Leah, my cousin, and the way her wedding season ended in quiet distance. How small decisions made for good reasons can still leave marks no one names. I began to understand that many women around me carried similar unspoken adjustments. Some were protective, some were limiting, some were both at once. If you have ever looked back and realized a hidden kindness or quiet control shaped your life, I would like you to share that here, and maybe that is what I learned too late. Not every absence is harm. Not every protection feels like care in the moment it is given. Sometimes you only understand the shape of love when you are standing far enough away from it. And if you are holding something like that now, I want you to know this. You are allowed to see both sides without choosing only one. You are allowed to carry the truth gently, even when it does not feel simple. That night, I touched the empty button space again before I folded the dress away. And I thought of my mother downstairs, still moving through quiet work in the lamplight. I thought it was just a missing button, until I learned how many stories begin that way. Tin box still sits in my cedar chest. I do not open it often, only when the house is very quiet and the wood has stopped shifting for the night. Inside, the pearl button rests the same way it always has. Small, pale, ordinary. It does not look like a story anymore. It looks like something you would forget on a table and only later realize mattered. My hands are slower now than they were that year. 61 winters have a way of teaching stillness, whether you ask for it or not. When I hold the button, I sometimes think of my mother's fingers first, not mine. Hers, the way she paused before she chose not to use it. Pause feels longer to me now than the decision itself. I used to believe meaning arrives loudly. Most of what I have lived through arrived quietly, like fabric settling after it is folded. No sound, no warning, only shape. There are evenings when I sit by the lamp and remember the wedding dress hanging in that first room. The empty button space does not hurt anymore. It simply exists, like a place where something once rested and no longer needs to. And sometimes I think of what I never asked my mother, not because I needed a different answer, but because I finally understood she had already given me the only one she knew how to carry. The lamp burns low then, and I let the night keep the rest.